he thought that he was a reincarnation of Robert Burns himself. So one of the fantastic things about Robert Burns is no one can actually say why his songs or poetry have been revered for so many years. Many of his poems are made up of one-syllable words, and very few lines, and incredibly basic in content. But in reality, they're real-life occurrences that perhaps we can all liken to, which is why, it stood the test of time. Possibly the most sung song of all lifetime is Auld Lang Syne. Most people don't even know who wrote it. Of course, Robert Burns did. But we're all happy to dance and sing it at New Year. So this is my short version of the immortal memory to Robert Burns, which is why we're here tonight. So Robert was born in Alloway in 1759 on the banks of the Doon. Naturally, in this time, family and living life was tough, and as a child, he was sent to work from an incredibly young age and stood on his own 2 feet pretty quickly. So the jobs that Robert Burns held in this time was a farmer, a tax collector, journalist, and a writer. The latter was always in his blood. For every spare moment, Robert was writing. The first farm that Robert Burns undertook was a tenancy in 1788, and the value of this was £50, and that was for a 3-year period. He was just 29 years of age at this stage, and the farm was called Ellisland, and was on the banks of the Neath. Albeit a bad decision that Burns took, he had reservations based upon the value of this farm, but he was influenced by Patrick Miller, who happened to be at the time the director of the Bank of Scotland, who had purchased an estate called Dalswinton, which the farm was situated. So more or less Burns was fleeced into buying it by this influential chap, which is quite sad. Burns was married with a child at this time. He'd been offered and accepted a job as an excise collector, because he didn't think the farm could keep him, and his writings certainly weren't bringing him any money. His wife at the time was Gina Moore, and their first child, Robert, his first wife was Gina Moore, and with their first child they moved on to the farm, where the farmhouse was built. And previously, Robert Burns was living alone on the farm in a shack which was incredibly run down. The work as an excise collector took Burns on a 200-mile round trip, taking him over a week on horseback. During this time, he tended the farm, and he still had time to write. Many an hour on the back of the horse laid time for his inspiration to his writings. And Burns started to collaborate with this chap called James Johnson, who happened to be an engraver who was producing an anthology, a Scottish song, and it was called the Scots Musical Museum. Burns was instrumental in the editing of this publication, which was published in 1788, went into 3 volumes, of which Burns had around 90 songs included. One of the strange things, I don't actually incorporate one in this little version, but Burns never made any money out of these, and but the musical museum, the Scots Musical Museum, made an awful lot of money. But Burns was instrumental in it, and got diddly squat from it, albeit he put so much into it. So 2 years later, in 1790, Burns sold the farm due to its poor soil, failing crops and unsustainability, even to raise cattle. This is one of his many affairs that he had, was with Anne Park, which resulted in a child. And his considerably understanding wife adopted the child as her own, and it was shortly followed by the birth of their 3rd child, William. So Robert Burns moves to Dumfries to continue his excise work, and he gets promoted to the Port Division. So he gets a great pay rise with more spare time to write, and in August 1792, Volume 4 of the Scots Musical Volume was published, with a further 50 of Robert Burns' songs. In 1793, the Burns family moved into a modest home in Mill Street, Dumfries, which is quite possibly one of the most famous little cottages around Burns. We've all seen a lovely little picture. So they took on a maid, and they had luxuries like a parlour, a kitchen, a study, And a wonderful thing at their time, they actually had carpet that we all take for granted. So he undertook a trip with a great friend of his called John Syme. Upon 2 Highland ponies, they trekked through Scotland, and the reason was to explore his curiosity of Scotland, which was where much of his inspiration came from. Burns wrote, "My way is this. I consider the poetic sentiment corresponding to my idea of the musical expression. Then choose my theme, begin one stance. When that is composed, which is generally the most difficult part of the business, I walk out, sit down, and then look out for the objects in nature around me that are in unison or harmony with the cogitations of my fantasy and workings of my bosom, humming every now and then the air of the verse I have framed. And when I feel my muse beginning to jade, I retire to the solitary fireside of my study and there commit my effusions to paper." In 1794, France and Britain were at war. Excise work was all but dried up and Burns was behind on his rent. His health was suffering, which was made worse through food shortages